Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Corey Piper, and I serve as the Brock Curator of American Art here at the Chrysler. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the lecture today and our distinguished speaker, Dr. William Coleman. Today's lecture is presented in conjunction with really a major project at the museum, which is the restoration of one of our really central iconic paintings, Thomas Cole's Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. This conservation project is happening in the galleries, not exactly as we speak, but on a daily basis. Some of you might have already noticed that the conservation is underway and that the painting is being transformed before your very eyes. So I hope that you'll all, following today's lecture and into the future, check in quite frequently, as it's really a great opportunity for us to help educate our public and to expose some of the ways in which conservation plays into our understanding of the... But without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We're very pleased to be joined by Dr. William Coleman, an expert on Thomas Cole and the history of American landscape painting, whose lecture today is titled Speculative Spirit, the Making of Cole's The Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. Dr. Coleman is an art historian and curator who serves as Director of Collections and Exhibitions for the Olana Partnership, where his duties include researching, preserving, and interpreting the extensive permanent collection, archives, and iconic buildings of the artist Frederick Edwin Church's iconic 250-acre designed landscape in Hudson, New York. Will earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, where his dissertation explored Thomas Cole's architectural imagination. He received master's degrees from the University of Oxford and the Courtauld Institute of Art, and completed his undergraduate studies at Haverford College. Before arriving at Olana, Will was Associate Curator of American Art at the Newark Museum and a teaching fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. Before that, he held many important fellowship positions at several esteemed institutions, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I had the pleasure of working together with Will as a Barrow Summer Fellow. And besides our scintillating American art discussions, Will kindly guided me through the tour of Philadelphia's iconic comfort foods. Will has curated numerous exhibitions, most recently the 2020 to 2022 nationally traveling exhibition, Cross-Pollination, Heed, Cole, Church, and Our Contemporary Moment. His synthetic and innovative research has been published widely, including the recent essay on the design process of Cole's studio for the Thomas Cole National Historic Site's current Thomas Cole exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Coleman.
Thanks everyone, thanks for coming out on this beautiful Sunday. I've so enjoyed getting to know this institution a little. Messages I can transmit coming to you from afar is that this place is a magnet and a mecca for the field of historical American art. This effort underway is really turning heads and very exciting to people like me. So I come from what we think of as kind of the heart of the Hudson River School, this remarkable artist environment in the mid-Hudson Valley of New York on the traditional lands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, a place with a long and a rich landscape history, and a landscape history that also gave rise to this remarkable object. I work at an artist environment directly across from Thomas Cole's own, now the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. It is a place of tribute to the impact of this remarkable artist, and indeed, to a certain extent, the impact of this remarkable object. So I've been steeped in this story, but I'm seeing this object with you for the first time today, seeing this conservation effort in process, rooting for you all from afar, and among other takeaways, I hope you will see just how deserving this remarkable object is of the care, of the love it's getting from this wonderful conservation staff, Mark Lewis and Jennifer Myers. So I've been thrilled to learn a little bit about the early discoveries that are coming to light in the process of looking into this, and I'll share some of that. I'm not the conservator, and you'll have to ask them for more insights, and I hope there will be a conservation-focused program down the road. Eric, I think that would be really interesting. My job is to put this in a wider context. I'm interested in Cole as a fascinating Anglo-American life, as a painter-architect, as a striver and a struggler who spent a all too short and often frustrated career trying to build a market for a serious art of landscape in the young United States. And I see this object in that context, as Corey's eloquent label alludes, this object did not meet with instant universal rapturous acclaim. It was a challenging object. It was a monumental work of clear ambition to make something on this scale. And it is a fascinating insight into an artistic personality and moment. So this conservation effort helps in getting to grips with just how the thing was made, the choices that went into making it look the way it does, the complex, they might even say tortured afterlives of this object that cause it to require a multi-year conservation effort. But through looking carefully at these different layers of meaning, from the technical to the historical to the religious and the socio-political, I think we can help to provide a deeper context for this thing. I hope you're all hearing me okay. I am prone to talking too fast sometimes, so feel free to wave at me if I do that, and I hope that we'll have a lively discussion later. And if anyone's interested, we can make a little field trip and go look at the object at the end and see what we see. It's fascinating now to stand in front of the handiwork of Mark and Jennifer, see the passages that are revealing the deep history with your own naked eye, not just with the tools of conservation science. So I've titled this Speculative Spirit. I hope you see what I'm driving at there. Two headings, the spirit, the spiritual, the religious subject matter, the overtly biblical subject, which is perhaps not what many historians think of when they think of Thomas Cole. I'll show you some of the things that did meet with immediate and rapturous public acclaim from Cole. And most commonly, they're not overtly, they're very often suffused with spirituality, a quite so fine a point on it as this one. The other part of this title, speculative, that this was a speculation made without a known buyer in mind, and it was a risk he took. Just the sheer mass of material, 15 feet wide by 9 feet high, the pigments that go into making that, the stretcher, indeed the frame. So this was a cost to an artist who was always struggling, who was not born into money, like I confess my artist, Frederick Church, was. At Olana, this castle on a hill, he had all this privilege that Cole never had. So he has the good fortune to build a monument to his own memory, this remarkable castle on a hill, Olana. For Cole, we come to places like the Chrysler to see this dispersed legacy, and what an inspiring and remarkable story it is. So I'll proceed under a few headings here. First, the kind of big picture of Cole's career and his world, the things he was responding to, the things that provide a context for this, the precursors and the processes that led to it. I'll take a deeper dive into the source material, the composition, and the choices in the object itself. And then as the final heading, I will give you a preview of what I hope will be things to come. What I'm understanding from your skilled conservation staff is coming to light from close examination and cleaning of the object, including, excitingly, not just technical, but art historical discoveries, insights of the tools of conservation science that help us to understand choices the artist was making, a sense of how he was working and why the painting looks the way it does. That might challenge received wisdom. So that's very exciting to me. That part will be very preliminary and very non-expert as a great fan of conservators, but not one myself. So I'll put the man on the screen himself, Thomas Cole there, in a portrait not so far distant in years from the period when he was making Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. Born there at the Red Pinpoint in the industrial north of England. So as you may know, this was the industrial heartland of England, a booming time in the Industrial Revolution. This was the part of the country that Blake referred to with the phrase dark satanic mills. So this was not pretty green bucolic England when he was growing up there. And that's part of the received wisdom, the story of how Cole begins, that he recognizes the ugliness of his home places and he responds against them. But his is a life of the transatlantic emigre. He's an American by choice. He travels to America with his family. In part, my understanding is fleeing creditors. They moved to the United States. So the financial insecurity that is a through line starts with his parents. They move first to Philadelphia, on to Steubenville, Ohio, and he has this kind of itinerant existence, working first in making engravings, reproductive media for calico printing. So he's steeped in the act of reproduction of original objects, thinking about how you make multiples of a singular object, and indeed reproductions will be part of our story here, the way artistic information is transmitted through work on paper, not just unique oil on canvas, if you see what I'm driving at. So he has this unusual path. We often think of our artists going to school, getting an MFA, and then going pro, as it were. He is a kind of self-made, self-designed, largely self-taught artist who picks up some training from an itinerant portrait painter coming through his part of Ohio. He does some portrait painting himself. Intriguingly, as we try to wrap our head around Thomas Cole as a maker of religious in general and biblical in particular subjects, we know that one of those very earliest subjects for which the title, if not the canvas, survives is Christ crowned with thorns. So he was always a person of sincere religious faith personally. He was making religious subjects from the very beginning, but these have not been the kinds of objects that have really become canonical, held up in Western Art 101, kind of survey of art that matters. They usually wouldn't be selecting paintings like those. I'll show you what really rises to the top for the received wisdom about Cole. So he has this itinerant existence back and forth through Ohio, picking up portrait commissions as he can. As a passionate amateur musician myself, I've always been fascinated by this part of his story that he was supporting himself by playing guitar and flute in the early days. So there are a surprising number of musical subjects in his painting practice, and that's an exhibition and a story for another day that has not been told, but somebody really should. An interesting person, and part of the reason why it's so rewarding to work on Cole and to spend time with his painting practice is he was such a voluble writer. Thousands and thousands of words of published essays and poetry, and then extensive preserved correspondence, which he seems to have envisioned reaching a public at some point, and most likely worked with his first biographer in collecting correspondence that would live on. So we know a lot about what he was thinking. We have a lot of insight into the making of objects like this one, and I'll share some of those comments for him. We have a received narrative also that we should share, the mythology of Thomas Cole, that centers on these two objects and one other, the moment of Cole's discovery. And I'm conscious in telling this story that it is a widely told story and truth and fiction blur, but you should know it all the same. The story of Thomas Cole's discovery. A young artist from the provinces convinces a bookseller, coincidentally but no relation, named William Coleman in New York City, to display 3 paintings, of which these are 2. In his shop window, William Dunlap, influential artist and writer, comes by, is stopped dead in his tracks, goes in and instantly buys one of these paintings, tells his influential friends, including Asher B. Durand, who's in your collection, and I'll talk about him later, and Colonel John Trumbull, the famous painter of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the American Academy of Fine Arts, about this discovery. And we have this juicy quote from Trumbull that gets into the press and launches this artist's reputation. Let's see here. I am delighted and at the same time mortified. This youth has done at once and without instruction what I cannot do after 50 years practice. What I now purchase for $25, I would not part with for 25 guineas, which is 5 times as much. So this gets into the public press. Dunlap writes the article, and this reputation is launched. He's quickly starting to get some commissions, and he's off to the races. But we should understand here, looking at objects like these, Lakewood dead trees in the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College, and landscape with a view of Fort Putnam, now part of the West Point complex in the United States Military Academy, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where Corey and I met. These 2 paintings are unexpected for their time, and they help to create a market for more objects like these. A serious focus on landscape as a subject deserving of a painter's attention in and of itself, and indeed as a subject that can convey loftier ideas, religious ideas, as we'll get to later, also historical, political, social, poetical, all these other philosophical, moral. This is Cole's life mission, to convince a reluctant public in a very new country that didn't have a lot of time for the visual arts in general, that landscape painting deserved a place with the most serious of art, and that would be history painting. Figures filling the frame, biblical subjects, battle subjects, a painting practice that was meant to be intellectually taxing because you're engaged with great books and deeds and you're trying to render them fairly on the page, as opposed to supposedly the mute subject matter of inanimate nature, a far lesser calling, far less psychology there, supposedly far less challenging, and so a minor art and so a less expensive art. This is what Cole's working with. So in view of Fort Putnam, you start to see that we have a cue to this in the foreground, the allegorical figure dressed in perhaps a Revolutionary War costume, looking back to the fortifications of, how do we pronounce this name, Theodore Kosciuszko, who was designing for the West Point complex, thinking about battles past and urging the viewer of the painting to reflect and remember. That's already a cue to a layer of meaning in the representation of inanimate nature that was not perhaps thought to be conventional in landscape painting of the time. And he goes on from there. And I'll show you again the expected in Thomas Cole as we get to some of the unexpected subjects along the way. We get to works like these, just moving on a little bit later. That discovery moment is roughly November 1825. Here we've got 1830 at left in Olana's collection, an object I really know, and I believe it's 1829, the expulsion, but I'll make sure I get that date right on my next page. 1828 in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So at left there, Solitary Lake in New Hampshire. Again, we've got this solitary figure in the foreground, problematically an indigenous figure that he's presenting as a cue to history, something that is presented as always already historical, not a clear and present threat in the landscape, something that has already passed away, to imagine a pre-European landscape. And this is troubling to a 21st century audience. He's not recognizing the contemporary indigenous history of this land, the living presence of these people in these lands, but there it is. And this is very common for the period. The Native American becomes staffage, as we call it, and a cue to a certain kind of reflection on deep history of land. And there, a biblical subject, right around the same period, 1828, before his first trip to Europe, which we'll get to, the expulsion of Adam and Eve. Let's see if I have a laser pointer here. There are those figures being cast out of the Garden of Eden into the wilderness. So the biblical, the directly biblical and not merely the vaguely spiritual is a through line in his career, even if it is not always the best known and best loved subject matter today. But what we see in this is a cultivation of a taste for a raw and wild vision of landscape. This, we understand, is one of his contributions, finding beauty in the landscape of the United States that was not as long cultivated on a European model as the landscape that had inspired Renaissance painters, as the landscape that had inspired John Constable and Thomas Gainsborough in England. So he is part of a crew of artists who are finding another kind of aesthetic value in the craggy grandeur of the landscape of the United States. And this is now very well loved. It is often talked about as this so-called Hudson River School. These fellow travelers who come after Cole and focus on subjects like that solitary lake in New Hampshire. My reason for highlighting that object is not just that it's in my care today, but because of the secret that lies beneath, that even this seemingly secular subject holds a secret. And this is the reason why we have been playing with some of the tools of conservation science recently, using infrared reflectography to look beneath that coal in search of what we know lies beneath, which is Hagar in the Wilderness, a previous painting, an explicitly biblical subject that the artist intentionally destroyed. And there's a really strong text record of this. There's a really clear link. We know this happened, we know it's there, but he destroyed it so well after examination that what you find is not the kinds of exciting smoking guns that Mark and Jennifer have found, but rather evidence of destruction, weird patches of lead white that are not explained by the surface. So this is an artist who was working and reworking, did not hesitate to destroy work he was not pleased with. There are all these layers of complex intervention in his canvases, as indeed we'll see later. Let's skip past one. Yes, indeed. We must not miss this. If we know Cole at all, this might be the kind of painting that comes to mind. not overtly religious in any way. Let me get the full long title. View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm, colloquially known as the Oxbow, after that bend in the Connecticut River there that looks like the yoke of an ox. So a legendary work of American landscape painting that uses seemingly quiet and inanimate nature to the passing storm, the cultivated field stretching out to the right. Even a little self-portrait of the artist at work, claiming this as an act of plein air observation, the artist's umbrella and sketchbook there, and Mr. Cole down below. But there are more layers still here. And if we try to make this a secular, marketable commodity, one interesting theory keeps on rearing up that has not been completely debunked yet, and I wonder if you'll see where I'm driving. Is there something in this painting of the language of religion, is my hint. So look around and see if you can see anything. If you were an art historian looking for something new to say about a legendary canonical painting, is there anything here that looks like written language? Any bright ideas? There is strangely a kind of I see the finger going up and down there. So yes, perhaps we look around left to right. Could it be in the clouds? Interestingly, this passage has really stopped people in their tracks, and an observation keeps on getting remarked. And I looked into this, I looked at the characters myself, and I think there's something to it, but we'll never be able to completely pin this down. The theory is that this is the Hebrew letters for one of the names of God upside down. Strangely. So it sounds like quite a leap of faith there, but the kinds of connections we can find there are the legend of was it Belshazzar's feast, where the writing on the wall appears. That legendary phrase, the writing is on the wall, the biblical story where characters appear on the wall behind you, and there is this whole art history of language being embedded in paintings like this one. So there is a prehistory, there is a reason to speculate in this way. We certainly know that this is a man of sincere religious belief. So it is possible that this is not just an allegory of the American experiment, the passage of the storm. Is it going away or coming toward? Is this the positive growth of civilization? Is this the negative destruction of the primeval forest? All of these layers are already there, but maybe there's also this additional one of seeing a kind of warning, a kind of writing on the wall. And Cole does often have a fairly pessimistic worldview. He writes about dollar-godded utilitarians who are cutting down the trees, the ravages of the axe, a famous work called The Essay on American Scenery, which was a proto-environmentalist text that was really remarkable and passed on that proto-environmentalist mission to his most devoted pupil, Frederick Church, and Olana is very much a tribute to that mission, a work of landscape restoration. So there are these reasons to believe he might have given us a message of warning, and we'll see other examples of that, like panels from two of his great allegorical cycles, The Course of Empire at left, The Voyage of Life at right. Again, things that might spring more readily to mind when we think about Cole and his biblical subjects. So this too at left is a warning, part of a 5-painting cycle imagining the rise and fall of a civilization on the model of ancient Rome or Greece, more likely Rome, to the peak of imperial decadence here, and then the fall and destruction and then return to the natural site. So that is very explicitly a kind of comment on what he was seeing in Jacksonian America, populist politics. He was very concerned about the direction his young country was going. And then The Voyage of Life. We've got our first angel that we'll see today. So an explicitly Christian but not biblical subject. Spiritual but not tied to any specific text. Youth from that series, and what interests me about this as a student of Cole, as a painter-architect, as a painter of architecture, and someone who would spawn other both painters and architects, the visionary architecture that this youth setting out on the journey of life, the angel bidding him adieu, he heads out towards this remarkable structure in the distance, which was made around the same time that Cole was participating and faring pretty well in the competition to design the Ohio State Capitol building. He ends up winning third prize in this. He's thinking about structures not unlike that one, great domed and colonnaded composites. And these ideas carry over between allegory and real life. So next time you go through Columbus, take a look at the State Capitol building. The building that was built there was largely Thomas Cole's design. Even though he only got third prize, they kind of co-opted his design at the end and made a composite of it. So when we see architecture in The Angel Appearing to the Shepherds, this is part of the story. This was a practicing architect. He was entered in New York City directories as T. Cole architect. And these little works of visionary architecture are a fascinating trace of that. Turning more to the explicitly biblical subject matter, that is a context for this remarkable object at the heart of your collection. The one at left is particularly closely related because we can connect it directly to the intensive period of figure study, particularly in Florence, that Cole engaged in for the making of Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. He recognized another bit of received wisdom about his practice, that he was not the most gifted figure painter and that he needed work on this, that he was wonderful at depicting trees and rocks, but some of his figures have been a little awkward over the years. I think these are quite accomplished, particularly the one at left, working from presumably a live model in Florence and capturing that form with the title, if not perhaps immediately recognizable in the content of the object, tying it to the subject of Cain and Abel. And at right, a much less well-known image that I think is a fascinating context for your work. This is part of an object that has now been cut in half. So I'm showing you I think it's the right half of a painting that has two parts. Let me get the dimensions right so I don't exaggerate. This is over 6 feet high, and the composite would have been something like 8 or 9 feet wide. Angels ministering to Christ, and the other half of it is now in the museum. This is at the Worcester Art Museum. The other half shows the devil fleeing now that he has been warded off, and that is in the museum. McMullen at Boston College very recently after deaccessioning by the Baltimore Museum. Another remarkably large biblical subject that I think is his closest next attempt after Angel Appearing to the Shepherds to capture the public's attention. So clearly, this was a person of sincere religious devotion. I'll add a little texture on that because it's important to understand what he's bringing to the making of Angel. He was a practicing, kind of high church Episcopalian, but he was certainly fascinated by the Catholic Church in his travels in Italy. He had a strong personal relationship with his pastor, Reverend Louis LeGrand Noble, who was his first biographer. Cole, even speaking of his architectural thought, designed his own parish church, the building that was built for his parish in Catskill, New York, just across the river from Hudson, where Olana is. So he does have this sincere religious belief throughout his life. He is making religious subjects, but is it only about an unsuppressible devotion, or is there an active market that is encouraging a striving artist who has serious financial insecurity, who doesn't have the luxury of painting without much likelihood of a buyer? Is it the case that there's a strong market for things like these? And here are some little glimpses of that market in the period, some useful context for your object. These are both images that precede Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. And I was fascinated to see in the gallery one that follows Angel Appearing to the Shepherds that I had not been aware of previously, God's Judgment upon Gog by Asher B. Durand, Cole's devoted friend, turned from engraving to painting because of his friendship with Cole. So clearly there's an afterlife to this object. Is there a prehistory? These are some of the case studies for that. So let me again get the dimensions just right, because these are very large, explicitly biblical paintings that do receive really warm receptions by an American public before Cole comes along and maybe encourage him to take this significant financial risk to make a 15-foot wide painting of a biblical subject. So we have Benjamin West, at this time president of the Royal Academy, and I was pleased to see a lovely West in your collection, 16 by 23 feet. So this is a tremendous object, Christ Rejected, retitled from its earlier title that no longer works, Christ Rejected by the Jews, a pretty uncomfortable subject in the 19th century. But a remarkable composition that now hangs in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. This object was displayed in Philadelphia in Independence Hall in 1830, before the 1833 to 4 period of Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. So this is very directly a precursor. This reaches an American public, is much written about. There are astonished onlookers writing accounts of this thing. So that is one little sign that there's a market for a large single picture exhibition of a biblical subject. And that I should underline. The format here is not a lone exhibition like American Artists in Venice. It is single picture, pay an admission ticket, a profit-making venture for an artist. And you have to work the press, you have to work the media, drum up public attention, because all you're going to see at the end of the day is one great big work of oil on canvas. Benjamin West played that game really well, and Claude-Marie Dubouf played it very well as well in these two, a pendant pair. So you get more for your money with Dubouf. You get 2 paintings for your admission to the exhibition, Adam and Eve in Eden, and then after their expulsion. And these were an international sensation. And here too, we can connect it very directly to the context for the making of Angel Appearing to the Shepherds. We know that their American tour placed them in March of 1833, not long before church dives into this, in late 1833, at the American Academy. John Trumbull's place, the very same place where Cole would pay for not inexpensive exhibition space, expecting a smashing success like Dubouf had received just a few months earlier for his great biblical subject of considerable scale. 10 feet high each to get that scale message across. There are a significant number of artists making very large biblical paintings in this early 19th century moment in the United States. There is inevitably another reason why these were so fascinating, which was a prurient American public was fascinated by the nude. This was not very common in the period, so they had that going for them. Cole did not, so maybe that's the reason why Cole met with a slightly different reception. But they tour around the country, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, 2 stops in New Orleans by popular demand, and Charleston. That's the kind of success that Cole is going for. He always feels like he's just one hit from breaking through, and it's kind of a sad story when you read it. He is a remarkable talent who is often frustrated, but there is inspiration in this, that he keeps on striving, he keeps on thinking the next big picture is going to be the thing that breaks through. And indeed, he has lived on. He is now the subject of major exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the National Gallery in London even. So the things that broke through stayed that way. They have stayed in the canon. They did really make a mark, even if he never fully got to enjoy the fruits of the market he had built. So just why did he think that there was a market for public commissions for paintings like these? And this I want to underline. Part of the reason why Cole takes this significant risk is not just because of the for-profit art exhibition success of people like Dubouf, but because he sees a pivot happening in his market. And this is, I think, one of the key takeaways I would like you to understand from this. Cole is an artist who comes up with an old money art buying public. The grand old families, the Federalist aristocracy, the Wadsworths, the Van Rensselaers, who once owned 750,000 acres of New York State, lords in the country, an American aristocracy in a very direct way. And he's seeing that aristocracy dying out, and he's seeing the rise of this new Jacksonian populism that he doesn't really identify with. He's not finding buyers for his ambitious subjects in the way he used to. And he thinks that next way to break through is a government buyer. And that's what he's going for when he takes this big risk. It is a strange thing to think that a religious painting would command a government audience, but this is evidence that it does. So this is a classic image of the aftermath of that horrible event on January 6th, Congressman Andy Kim cleaning up in the Capitol Rotunda with over his shoulder 2 explicitly Christian subjects in that hall of government. The landing of the Pilgrims, and let me get their dates right, John Gadsby Chapman, the baptism of Pocahontas, 1840 at bottom, and Robert Weir, 1843, the embarkation of the Pilgrims, not their arrival, apologies. So these are examples that there was an audience for very large, explicitly Christian subjects in the halls of government. And in the very same years as he's making preparatory works for Angel Appearing to the Shepherds, as he's building toward the finished painting, he is having his name put forward by friends for consideration for this kind of commission, and he becomes a U.S. citizen at the same exact time. This is not a coincidence. This is all right in the same period in 1833. He's wondering if I can be the next John Gadsby Chapman, the next person who gets that kind of grand public commission, even though I'm not strictly speaking a maker of history paintings, which is what I would call these. I am a mere landscape painter, but I infuse my subjects with great deeds and events and intellectual and spiritual uplift, and this is my argument. Here is a landscape for you in the Chrysler Museum that is both landscape and history painting. That is all these things at once. So that is another key part of the background context. So as we turn to the meat of this, the object itself, the choices he's making within it, this is a well-known part of the backstory. I'm hoping I can share some things that are not well-known, received wisdom to all who love this painting, but we should certainly look together at what we know very explicitly was a key inspiration for it. Rembrandt's etching of the angel appearing to the shepherds, which Cole saw at the British Museum in 1829. And he said of it, let me get the quote just right, it is truly sublime on this visit. So he was soaking up all that he could learn from European art. He was really admiring this particular object, and you can see the resonances. It might not be evidence of this scale of reproduction as it is in the gallery, that he has chosen not just the upper left composition for the grand singular angel, but also this array, this heavenly host is dotted throughout the clouds there if you look closely. So he's copied that composition, the angel coming in from the left, the shepherds in awe below. But he has expanded considerably this composition, stretched it into this really imposing, really inspiring, immersive environment, which was also infused with contemporary visual entertainments like the panorama, the cyclorama, new immersive painting technologies, popular entertainments, not highfalutin fancy art, but things that would be fun to go and see. You could feel like you're immersed in the Battle of Gettysburg. There'd be a three-dimensional cannon and busted rifles in the foreground to make you feel like you're in the painting that's wrapping all the way around you. These were a hit in Cole's time, and artists like Cole challenge our notions of high and low. He is fascinated by those visual entertainments too, all the technologies at his disposal, and is thinking panoramically in making this object. He hopes this will be an engaging object that meets with the approval of a broad public. So he hopes you'll feel more immersed in his object than you might have in the work of Rembrandt. The fact that Cole himself has this background in printmaking, that he began as an engraver himself, means that he brought that knowledge of making to this print medium, this reproductive object of which many different prints survive. I hope you understand. He was thinking about the choice of line making, black and dark as black and light, your materials to work with here, the chiaroscuro. So the way in which this painting starts to map the blinding white in select sections and then the deep depths of darkness in others harks back as well to that engraving tradition. So how did this come together? We know that source material wasn't just moving whole cloth from that originary object to his own take on it with, and again, you see the architectural thinker here. I am fascinated by that ruined passage there and the long history of towers in the landscape. John Constable's Hadley Castle comes to mind, and Cole's own past and present in the Mead Art Museum at Amherst. There are many other passages like that in Cole paintings, a topic for another time. How does this come together? So we know that he was deeply engaged in this process of figure study in Florence. There are some great comments from his peers that show that when he was trying to become a better figure painter, it was already widely known what this was for. So let me give it to you in the words of the great sculptor Horatio Greenough, writing to James Fenimore Cooper, author of Last of the Mohicans and so much more. Cole is studying the figure with astonishing success and is now painting a composition of the angel appearing to the shepherds, in which the figures are principal. I'll give you the second half of the quote in a moment, but I want to underline this is 1831 to 2 in Florence. Long before the 1833 to 4 making of the object that we'll get to later, he's already focused on it. He's trying to figure out the figures that would be needed. He recognizes that this is a gap in his expertise, that he needs to grow as a figure painter. So he's working from the live model, thinking about figures of awe in the face of the angel there with his model on the floor of a studio in Florence, looking toward that long-term project. So this is project management. This is thinking about all the steps he needs to accomplish along the way to get to a 15-foot wide painting that would be accomplished in the end shockingly quickly. The reason why the finished thing is so fast is because there's been all this legwork going up to it. another of these figures that we'll see when we look back to the full composition of these surviving figure studies that are well known. These are not new discoveries by any means, but there are some exciting new discoveries coming from the conservation science. Figure studies that have now found their use through looking beneath the paint, which is very exciting to me. These remarkable objects in your own collection help us to see the next stage in the process, working from the small piece of the puzzle, the individual figure that will be needed to create the effect the artist desires, to compositional thinking. How will we map this out over the scale I'm going for? Where exactly will the figures be oriented to the angel in space? How will they relate? How will their postures make sense with the foreground flora, the tree, and the vegetation at right front? And then we start to see a little hint that he's looking for another passage of visual interest here. Not just the star that already appears there, but also the tower coming in. So he's giving us a lot to sink our teeth into, multiple passages of interest emerging, and the question might become, as it was for some period critics, whether those many different ideas fully resolve into a complete whole at the end. And we can fight that out later, see how we feel about it. I do think it is a really remarkably accomplished object, but we'll also face head on some of the contemporary criticism. Sure, let's go right into it. Yeah.
What size these are?
Maybe Corey remembers. I don't think I have their dimensions in front of me.
They're small, about 10 or 12 inches wide.
10 to 12 inches wide was the answer, yeah. So that's pretty standard for a little oil study. Church works in the same method, so I'm steeped in Church's oil studies. The method learned from Cole is to go first from graphite on paper to small oil study like this. And then fascinatingly, the thing that's really interesting to me right now, both in Cole and Church, is the leap that follows. And maybe Mark and Jennifer will find some evidence of pouncing or transfer lines, but so far we don't have any evidence of an intermittent step between 12 inches and 15 feet. And that blows my mind. There are precedents for that in Western art. Raphael's cartoons, a famous example where there is a tool that helps you get to the large finished thing. For both Cole and Church, there's this huge visual leap as far as I can tell. No evidence that they're using technologies like the camera obscura, some of these early projection technologies to render at larger scale the composition you're working with. I've never seen proof of that. It is just figuring it out at small scale so that you can use all the tools at your disposal, all the training you've been working on for decades to render it across 15 feet in 2 months, which is shocking. This is very short for a painting of that scale, and we'll get to the science of that haste a little bit later. So we get to the overall composition again. We know that he rents rooms in New York for the making of it and indeed for the display of it, and he has to work quickly. This is the thing that takes up a lot of real estate. You couldn't display it just anywhere. Always that financial pressure in the back of his mind. So this 2-month process, and the speed of its execution is prominent in the critical reception. So let's stay attuned to that later. I've been really fascinated to hear from some of the conservation discoveries that things that might read as errors of haste might actually be really intriguing choices about what shows through to the surface. And it's all very preliminary, but I was fascinated by some of the ideas that Jennifer shared. A quickly made painting. It is a very thinly painted painting. It is a painting that seems, from what I understand from your professional conservators here, seems to reflect economy in its materials. He was painting thinly. Oil paint is not cheap, actually. The pigments that go into it, the minerals, these are often rare substances, and he's working very rapidly with very thin layers of paint to execute this big, complicated idea. And I hope I'm characterizing this correctly. I'm conscious of the real experts in the technical study of these things in the room, so please do correct me if I'm mischaracterizing any of that. So you've got the big overarching composition here. You see the figures emerging here. We've seen studies for the figure kneeling in prayer or awe, the standing figure, mouth agape, other figures that are familiar from other works of classical art. Interestingly, another similar scene happening in the distance here, another kind of revelation to the angels. And then we go back to the illuminated manger, the star, the classic Christian story of Christmas, in the shadow of one of Cole's classic ruined towers, this famous subject that recurs in his work. So perhaps the eye moves something like this, from foreground figures right at your eye level to that which has awed them and others who have been received similarly. And maybe our eye goes across with the hand of the angel to the tower and the star, something like that. But you have this big discrepancy between the spotlight on the foreground and on the angel and on the manger, and this incredible inky darkness in between. And that is something that some would object to. It may be a painterly effect, it may be insufficiently harmonious to others, but it is worthy of comment. And again, conservation may give us some new insights into its original appearance and its intended appearance. So we have some useful insights into the period of the making, of its initial display. Some of these useful quotes from this incredibly voluble and verbal artist include writing to one of his close friends, what have you been doing? Painting too, I suppose, and making money, which is what I cannot do much of. I hope you will go and see my big picture of angels, but be indulgent. It was painted in about 2 months. I could not afford more. There's some useful things in there. The money pressure, the fact that he was working that quickly because of money pressures, and that he's trying to lure people to come and see it and hoping that it will make the mark that he hoped for after working on it for more like 4 years, not just the 2 months of its painting. So he's getting ready to put it on view at the American Academy, this 15-foot wide object. He's working with a press agent to try to bring people in. And he is struggling a little bit with the initial reception of the object. I'll give you some of these original critical responses. William Dunlap, that same critic who was part of the initial discovery narrative of Cole. We understand that the work was a very rapid work, a work of less than 2 months. If Mr. Cole can thus produce a picture of so much merit, what may we not expect from future efforts upon which he can bestow more time and equal talent? That's his close friend and ally saying, it's a little hasty, but this guy, the fact that he could make it that quickly is itself amazing. And not all critics were quite as friendly. William Herbert for the American Monthly Magazine dismissed its patchy and somewhat piebald appearance, which always strikes our eye offensively, one half bright light, the other half deep shadow. He also ended on a kind note, and he said, to paraphrase, if it sounds like we are critical, it's only because we are conscious of all that Mr. Cole is capable of. For another artist, this would be a monumental achievement. Cole can do a little bit better than this, we see. So it's challenging for him. He sends it on the road. It goes to Albany, it goes to Boston, the Boston Athenaeum, and there our story continues to the final chapter. I'll rapidly conclude with the afterlives. It's in the Boston Athenaeum where it comes to be in the collection. There is a fire. It is rolled and put in storage. Rolling of a work on canvas is not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing. This is something that happens from time to time. It is cloth fundamentally, and if it's done carefully around an inner support, nothing terrible has to happen. But something terrible happened in this case. So this is reproduced on your wall in the gallery. I was shocked when I saw it for the first time talking with Jennifer. So she helped me to understand what we're seeing here. Rolling very tightly like a wrapping paper tube without any kind of internal support, and then smashed so that those rolls become flat creases that go all the way across, that now, with this fascinating work in progress, you can see with the naked eye. You'll see these vertical. And then it seems that it was also folded over vertically. So picture a huge tube, 9 feet high, mashed down flat, that under its own sheer weight flopped over. So that may be what we're talking about with some of these horizontal lines. A lighter patch of paint loss right there. So this is what they have to work with. It's astonishing that it looks as good as it does. It will look even better when this effort is completed, but it is a hurting object. It has not been well treated over the years, and we're so fortunate that it survives at all. It was not discarded. It is wonderful that it is on view in the Chrysler Museum of Art. It is wonderful that it is receiving this multi-year effort, which is both restoring, as I understand it, underlying structural defects that are part of it back to 1833, and remediating earlier conservation work in painting on those vertical creases that has not aged well from, I believe it was the 1970s. So this is what lies beneath, and knowing this backstory hopefully only makes it more interesting. It encourages close looking. We can go and stand with the object and think about all these layers of technology that went into it. There's Mark up there on the scaffold using the tools of, I believe that's infrared reflectography here, close examination of the paint layer to understand its consistency, and then in some later discoveries what lies beneath. So this is the sort of thing that's ongoing in your institution, while the whole field, as I can attest, is watching with great interest and admiration. There's no object like this in the world. It's a remarkable survivor. It is this document of, as I said, a struggler and a striver who had this tremendous ambition for great public commissions that never is fully realized. But it is this life and legacy that live on. It is one that spawns others like Frederick Church at Olana. And there are these fascinating new insights as a preview of things to come. The conservators were kind enough to share some of this early imaging, and you must insist of your institution on a conservation-focused program down the road, a symposium, a publication. There's so much good work being done here that I will be first in line to read some kind of final report of the findings. But you'll notice another figure here. So this is a very exciting early discovery of the process. We finally understand what this figure is that you will not see in the painting on the wall with your naked eye. This is what the powerful tool infrared reflectography gives us, that there was originally another seated figure looking up at the angel here. The kinds of things that are possible with conservation science. I've been really intrigued to learn from your conservators about the consistency of the canvas itself, how it is cobbled together from different sections, this rough strip across the bottom that you can clearly see with the naked eye, stitched together, and then apparently also evidence of another line of added canvas at the top. And then one of these really fascinating things I'm trying to wrap my head around still from my conversation with Jennifer is this idea of an imprimatura layer, and basically an under layer that is showing through to the surface. Is that loss over the years? Is that a mistake? Or is that, fascinatingly, possibly an economical painting method by a financially strapped painter who was trying to make it work and find a way to get this impressive object done, and painting in a rather unusual way, showing your scaffolding, as it were, the things you would not usually see in a painting as surface effect. So you're seeing that reddish hue showing through in these cross sections of paint. And if you're seeing these for the first time, isn't this exciting? These are microscopic fragments of the layers that are built up in oil on canvas. We in the field sometimes forget how novel this privileged way of looking is. Microscopic flecks of paint that you would never miss in the finished painting, and you're able to look through them on the side and understand how a painter's building up the surface you see, which light passes through. You need to have these underlayers to produce the finished effect, and that particular layer is really fascinating. And you see that in some of the imaging Jennifer kindly shared, that pinkish hue showing through to the surface. We might just say that is damage to the painting over the years. It could just be a mistake. But there is this other intriguing theory that this was strategic, and I'd love to understand that a little better. So consider that hypothesis at some point, that Cole was, to make it work, to paint economically, working so thinly by using his underpaint as surface value, as an intended surface appearance. And then what we can also see with the naked eye in the galleries, I was delighted to see that today, the remarkable things that are already happening just from removing discolored varnish, which is not an unscientific process in and of itself. It's a very delicate matter, but it's amazing to see how much the appearance of the painting has been improved already. So we return back to the full painting, and I'm a little past time here, but I think of this object as this really remarkable statement of an ambitious artist who is trying to find a new market and doing whatever it takes to get there. I find it an inspiring story, and I hope that you will too, an artistic spirit that would not be repressed, a grand idea carried out over 4 years, even when rebuffed by the critics, even when it didn't instantly meet with the kind of acclaim DeBuff and West might have had before him, kept on working in this vein, kept on attempting great cycles and efforts to fuse landscape painting and history, landscape painting. I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd be very glad to take any questions, and we can get beyond the formal dais and all that. We have microphones here. We are recording this, so if you have any questions you'd like to pose, I'd ask that you enter it into the microphone so it can live on as well. Worst case, I can just repeat it. But is there anything that sticks in your mind from this? Anything you'd like to talk through a little more? Yeah, Eric.
I'll start.
Is that on?
Yeah, okay, no, it's on, yeah. So could you talk just a little bit more about this magnificent, grand painting and the cycles that you referenced a little bit, and how you see the rapport between this and the cycle of, empire and life?
Absolutely. The first key distinction I would make with the Course of Empire and the Voyage of Life is that neither were speculative. He had a buyer for each. They were costly to make, but at least when he got started, he had somebody who was fronting the financial risk for him. There is an interesting story. Again, this unlucky artistic career, the Voyage of Life, the intended buyer dies while he's working on it, and his estate does not want to finish the project. And there are all kinds of legal tangles. There's this fascinating story that I think I may be the first to compare to the story of Taylor Swift re-recording her work to get out of an earlier contract. It's exactly what Thomas Cole did. He repainted the Voyage of Life to get out of that thing. They were not letting him show it, this really restricted estate. He kept on finding solutions, but he was not as lucky in life as his student Frederick Church was at Olana. So they are similarly works of monumental ambition. They're not quite as financially risky for him. They are Period of the Shepherds does not, a reproductive afterlife in engraved media. And fascinatingly, a whole other surrounding visual culture. And this is what Paul Schweitzer, a resident of your region now, I believe he's over in Chesapeake somewhere, former director of the Munson Williams Proctor Art Institute, has taught us about the Voyage of Life in particular. This fascinating response to it by folk artists all over the country. These things were so popular and they spoke to people, perhaps in a deeper spiritual way, that there are dozens and dozens of copies after Cole's Voyage of Life. I acquired one for the New York Museum. They're fascinating objects. Mary Jane Tanner, a little-known woman artist who made a copy after that very panel I showed you, Youth, with the amazing cloudy city in the distance. So similarly ambitious. In the case of Course of Empire, overtly political, perhaps not so much about religion. Voyage of Life very much engaged with that whole Christian worldview that pervades his career, speaking to an audience that he presumed was of the same religious belief, and sometimes those objects are challenging for us today where we can't make that same assumption of our audience. I think they're really interesting to think with, and I think that they are due for a comeback. They have been a little bit overlooked. Cole, we love to talk about the Course of Empire. We love to talk about the Oxbow. Things like this are less well known by people like me in the field, and they deserve to be back in the spotlight, as the Chrysler Museum is doing. Any other questions? Yes, and if you don't feel like walking up to the microphone, I can repeat it for you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, what happened to the painting? What happened to it? Did he ever make any money from
He never made much money from it. It sounds like in most of the tour expenses for the space to display such a large object just about outweighed the receipts that came in. It was close. He might have just about broken even. He does find a buyer who does not pay a colossal sum for it, like some of these very large paintings by Frederick Church in decades to follow. He finds a buyer who places it in the Boston Athenaeum, and there it remains, not always in the best of circumstances. So it's a struggle. He has these brief moments where it does feel like he's breaking through. The Course of Empire is one of those great moments, and he turns the audience's head. The huge outpouring of grief when he dies is evidence of the mark he made as one of these really pioneering artists who builds a market, but never really enjoys the spoils of that success.